All right, guys. So this will be our Harding Coolidge Hoover test review. All right. So remember, this is covering a decent amount of time, right? So from the very end of World War One, going all the way to 1929, and we see the stock market crash, and the Great Depression takes over. Okay. So starting off with how we end out World War One. Remember, we come out of World War One and we are isolated and neutral. Okay. All right. When we come into this new after war time period in the United States, we are slowing everything down. Now, remember, immediately after the end of World War One, we go into this time period called the Red Scare. Okay, and in this, we have a fear of immigrants and radicals. Okay, remember, primarily because we feel like those immigrants and radicals are bringing communism to the United States. Okay, all right, communism. Okay, the fear that is taking over in the United States. Now, remember, a man that I told you to make sure you remember was A. Mitchell Palmer. Okay, this attorney general in the United States who started the Palmer raids. Okay, and remember with the Palmer raids, he was anybody, he was going around and anybody who was uh, convicted of being a communist or an immigrant or a radical, he was arresting. Now, remember, the issue that arose with that is that the vast majority of people he ended up arresting were immigrants, right? And it was really showcasing the nativist ideas that had really taken hold in the United States in the years leading up to the 1920s. Now, remember a big aspect of the Red Scare, and one of the biggest cases that comes out of the Red Scare is the case of Sacco and Vanzetti. Right, remember we did the whole murder mystery assignment, okay, to try to figure out was their execution justified, right? And so we essentially find out that these two men are arrested simply because they were Italian immigrants, and obviously there were all these other factors that really played a role into their arrest and conviction as well. Okay, but what was really showcased in the United States was that there was a sense of nativism, okay, in this court case, right, where you had these two Italian immigrants who were caught in a really rough place. Now, remember, as a big result of the Red Scare were these immigration laws that we get, the Emergency Quota Act, the Immigration Act of 1924, right, where we start to put some severe limits on immigration into the United States. And you see with your political cartoon here, just that, right? And you see the funnel and Uncle Sam putting this 3% gate. Okay, remember with the Emergency Quota Act, we're only going to see 3% immigration into the United States. Okay, going into the very early 1920s. Now, remember, also coming out of World War One, we go into a farming crisis where our farmers are going into overproduction. Right, they don't fall back into an after-war scenario. Okay, they're still producing as if we were in the midst of war times. Okay, and so that ends up bad for them. But on the flip side of that, we have a business boom, okay, which is greatly impacting our economy, okay, which means money is flowing into the United States. All right. And at the end of everything, we are practicing isolationism, okay, hardcore and forever. Okay, at least under these three Republican presidents, neutrality and isolationism was the name of the game. All right. So take a second to answer practice question number 1. Now, also don't forget the life of the 1920s, the culture that started to grow, right? With the election of 1920, you get the 19th Amendment, right? The first time that women are able to vote in the United States. Okay, remember one of the biggest issues of the election in 1920 was the League of Nations, Warren G. Harding, right? Or James Cox, are we going to join the League of Nations? Are we not going to join the League of Nations? And overwhelmingly, remember, the United States voted that we would not join the League of Nations. We were not going to be involved in foreign affairs. All right, then we had the birth of the jazz age, and with that came flappers, right? These new age women who were breaking down status quos and what was expected of them in society, right? And then another huge part of the jazz age was the Harlem Renaissance, right? And so Langston Hughes was a huge part of that. Remember, he's one of your authors you have to know for your 6th author question on this test. Right. So remember, he'll write a poem called Let America Be America Again, right, where he discusses what life was like for African Americans in the United States, which is what the Harlem Renaissance was all about, a way for African Americans to showcase their culture and their talents. All right. Another African American men that you need to know, okay, who are activists for African Americans. One, Marcus Garvey. Remember, he gives us this thing called Black nationalism, where he was trying to bring in a sense of pride in being Black that had been really non-existent in the United States up until this point. Right. And then another man, A. Philip Randolph, who is a Black socialist who is fighting for the rights of workers. Okay. Because remember, going into the 1920s, we take a turn back to the laissez faire atmosphere, right, where our government is very much more hands off in terms of business. Okay. And so A. Philip Randolph starts to kind of fight more for the workers, whereas the government is looking back towards the business owners. All right. And then we have prohibition in the 1920s. That's also a huge thing. Okay. We have the Noble Experiment. Remember, it was meant to make society better. Right. And we kind of found out a little later that it does almost the exact opposite. Right. Because a lot of people said we were legislating morality. Okay. We couldn't legislate what was right and wrong. You had to let people figure that out for themselves. Okay. All right. So take a second and answer practice question number 2. All right, then we have technology in the 1920s, and we know that takes a total turn from what we were used to. Okay, starting with Henry Ford, the assembly line. Okay, creating his Model T, and with the assembly line and mass production, he's able to cut that price almost in half, right, from what it used to be worth. Okay, to now the average American family could own a car. Okay, which remember led then to the suburbs, right? People moving out of the city, okay, to have a better opportunity both in education and lifestyle. Okay. All right. Also, with technology of the 1920s, it leads to a lot of leisure time. Okay. I remember the stations activity we did. Okay. You showcased the washing machine and the vacuum cleaner and all of these new technologies that saved Americans a lot of time, which left a lot of time over. Okay. And we got to figure out how are we going to spend that time a little differently. All right. A lot of that was listening to the radio, got mass media. All right. Some of the elections that are coming up, we know are going to be broadcasted over the radio. All right, for the mass public to hear. All right, under this, you also have religious fundamentalism. Remember the Scopes trial, also known as the Scopes monkey trial, right, where we had the biology teacher teaching evolution instead of biblical creation that the Tennessee law said he was supposed to be teaching. And so remember, the big idea we got through that is science versus religion. We saw on one side of the spectrum the old traditional values growing strong, but on the other hand, with the younger generation coming in the 1920s, okay, we had a whole new set of beliefs. Okay. And so we saw a lot of people going towards fundamentalism, okay, trying to bring back that hardcore Christian stance in the United States. And then finally, with technology in the 1920s, don't forget Charles Lindbergh. Remember, he makes the airplane a lot more feasible in the 1920s. Okay, he makes the first solo nonstop trip from the United States to Europe across the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, becomes the first person ever to do that. Okay, so it opens up a whole new scope of what we now know airplanes are capable of. All right, so knockout practice question number 3. Remember economic policies of the 1920s. Okay, under Harding, right, we said less government and business, more business and government. Under Coolidge, the chief business of government is business. And then Hoover, the government should be an umpire instead of a player in the economic game, right? All leading to this one common idea of laissez-faire in government, right? We're going to let the businesses play business, and the government is going to take a step back. All right, we're going to let business boom yet again. Okay. Now, remember, under Hoover's presidency, you had your causes of the Great Depression, speculation, right? We're buying stock, but we don't know if it's going to make money or lose money. People are buying on the margin, which remember, in a nutshell, that just means they're buying stock with borrowed money, right? And so they buy the stock, they're already in debt. They hope that they're going to make money, but they don't really know. Right, credit becomes a really big issue because you have all of these people in the United States that are buying and buying and buying and buying things on credit and never paying it off, and then ultimately never having the ability to pay it off. All right, and then we know we're in overproduction with our farmers as well. Okay, all right, make sure you remember the date of the stock market crash, October 29th, 1929, Black Tuesday. Right, the day that the stock market crashes and we officially go into the Great Depression. All right, and then remember Hoover's policies toward this, mainly rugged individualism. Right, he said the government's not going to come back you up or protect you. Okay, this is going to totally be on your own. Right. And then finally, you have the Smoot-Hawley tariff under Hoover's policies. Remember, this is one of the things he did to try to make America money, but it backfired very heavily. This really, really high protective tariff put into effect in the United States was meant to draw money in and protect American businesses, but it ended up just killing trade. Right. And we see trade decrease almost by 50% during the 1920s across the globe. All right, and then finally, you have the bonus army. Okay, remember the bonus army in 1924? They were promised a bonus, right? These World War I veterans were promised a bonus from coming back from the war, and they were promised after 20 years, so in 1945, that they would get this bonus. Well, in 1932, after the Depression had hit really hard, they came back to Congress and they wanted to get that bonus early, and Congress told them no, and it turned into a whole violent incident between the World War I veterans and then local police and ultimately the National Guard that had been brought in by Hoover. Remember the National Guard led by Douglas MacArthur ended up using violent means, weapons, tanks, tear gas to get rid of these World War I veterans and painted a really bad light for Hoover as president. All right, so take a second to answer practice question number 4. All right, and practice question number 5. All right, and then last but not least, make sure you remember your notable writers of the 1920s. Okay, remember one of your questions on your test coming up. All right, you'll have to match the writer to the book. Okay, so you have your 6 writers there: Fitzgerald, Hughes, Steinbeck, Hemingway, Hurston, and Faulkner. Right, make sure you know their book. All right, don't miss this question because you do not know the writers. Okay. All right, and as always, don't forget the A-Day, B-Day morning reviews during zero block. Okay, if you want a good in-depth review of all the material right before we take the test, make sure you are there for that. And if you have any questions along the way, make sure you let me know. Good luck on your test.